Hello. Today we're going to be looking at U.S. History, Chapter 17, The New Frontier and the Great Society. What we're looking at in this chapter is really the presidencies of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or JFK, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, who succeeded him as president. And so as we start out into this chapter, and we move into the first section, the main idea is that President Kennedy continued the Cold War policy of resisting the spread of communism by offering to help nations and threatening to use force if necessary. Our learning objectives are to describe the ways that Kennedy's election as president suggested change, and to describe the major Cold War conflicts of the Kennedy administration. So looking first of all at Kennedy's election. John F. Kennedy came from a wealthy, politically connected family. He was good looking, young, relatively, for a president, and comfortable in front of television cameras. People felt that Kennedy represented the future. So he runs for president in the election of 1960, and he adopted the term New Frontier. And he played on the nation's Cold War fears. He claimed that the nation's prosperity was not reaching the poor. He rallied the African American vote when Kennedy called Coretta King after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested. Robert Kennedy, or Bobby, his brother, persuaded the judge to release King. And he won one of the closest elections in history. Now, his opponent in the 1960 election was Richard Nixon. We talked about Richard Nixon in a previous chapter. Back in 1952, Nixon was selected as Eisenhower's running mate in the 1952 presidential election, and of course saved his spot after he was accused of being dishonest by going on TV in what became known as his checkers speech. So Nixon ends up running for president in 1960. So he is the sitting vice president as Eisenhower is preparing to leave, and he runs, of course, against Kennedy. Kennedy defeated Nixon in one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Looking at the vote, as far as the electoral vote, Kennedy took 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219. But as far as states carried, Kennedy actually only carried 22 states, as where Nixon carried 26. But in the popular vote, he had a slight margin of really only probably about 100,000 votes. He actually won by 49.7 to 49.6%. So we're talking 0.1% separating the two candidates in terms of the popular vote. And one real key in this election was the first televised debate in history. Most experts believe that this is what really probably tipped the election to Kennedy. Nixon insisted on campaigning up until just a few hours before the first debate started, and he had not completely recovered from a hospital stay and thus looked pale and sickly. Kind of looked also underweight and tired. He refused makeup for the first debate, and as a result, his beard stubble showed prominently on the era's black and white TV screens. Kennedy, by contrast, rested and prepared extensively beforehand. He appeared tanned, confident, and relaxed during the debate. An estimated 70 million viewers watched the first debate. People who watched the debate on television overwhelmingly felt that Kennedy won, while radio listeners, which was a much smaller audience, felt that Nixon had won. And that really showed how the image of the candidate being conveyed on the television screen changed people's perceptions, because those that listened to the debate only on the radio thought that Nixon won. Those that actually watched it on TV, where they had the visual component, felt that Kennedy had won. And there is a great likelihood that Kennedy's performance in the debate versus Nixon's performance ultimately tipped the election, being that it was such a close election. So Kennedy takes office. In his inaugural address, he focused on change, and it really had a strong anti-communist tone. He did not specify his domestic policy goals because so much division existed over domestic issues. Now, as far as advisors, Kennedy gathered a group of what some called the best and the brightest as his advisors. Most of Kennedy's advisors were young, and his closest advisor was his brother, Bobby. Cabinet members had less influence than the White House advisors. And one new challenge that he was going to have to deal with was Cuba. Fidel Castro was in power in Cuba. Castro had come to power in 1959 during the Eisenhower administration and became the leader of Cuba after a guerrilla war. And he promised to restore people's rights and freedoms, but once in power, he seized private businesses and made overtures to the Soviet Union, which immediately made him an enemy of the United States. So an invasion plan was put forth during the Eisenhower administration, and they agreed to train Cuban exiles for this mission. So when Kennedy becomes president, he inherits this invasion plan, and he decides to go ahead with it. So what was happening is the CIA was training troops, these troops being Cuban exiles that had came here to the United States, training them to go back into Cuba and to topple Castro. Kennedy's advisors were mixed, and Kennedy was worried about communism spreading to Latin America, so he gave the go-ahead. Now, the invasion force was launched at a place called the Bay of Pigs, and that's thus what the invasion becomes known as, the Bay of Pigs invasion. It failed. Partially, Kennedy kind of backed off a little bit on some airstrikes that would have provided support, and information was leaked early. Like I said, the airstrikes failed. Castro was prepared for a land attack, and the invaders were captured and then ransomed back to the United States. That strengthened Castro's ties to the Soviet Union and also became a huge embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. Even though Eisenhower did come forward and kind of accept responsibility for the planned invasion, the fact of the matter is Kennedy still gave the go-ahead, and ultimately it looked bad on Kennedy. We also experienced a crisis in Berlin during this time frame. We've already, of course, talked in previous chapters about how Berlin had been divided by the Soviets into where they kept, we actually at the end of World War II divided up the city of Berlin into 4 sectors. And the Americans, the French, and the British reunified their sectors. But that was in opposition to what the Soviets wanted, and they kept their sectors of both Berlin and of Germany separate and set up communist governments. So Nikita Khrushchev, who became the leader after Joseph Stalin passed away, or became the leader, I should say, of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev demanded that the United States recognize East Germany as an independent communist nation. West Berlin was an island of freedom. And to understand that, what you have to remember is that the city of Berlin, which was the capital of Germany historically, was located deeply within the Soviet-held sector of the city, or of Germany. And when they divided up Germany into 4 sectors, the sector that was held by the Soviets, which becomes, now that they recognize it as East Germany, a communist nation, the city of Berlin is deep within that sector. And so the city of West Berlin, which is now divided from East Berlin, becomes this isolated pocket of democracy and freedom located right inside the Soviet-held sector. And Khrushchev doesn't like that. And so Kennedy really kind of refused to be bullied around by Khrushchev, and he sent troops into West Germany, built nuclear shelters, and then waited for Khrushchev's next move. And the next move really came on August 13th, 1961, when Khrushchev closed the crossing points between East and West Berlin. And a high concrete wall was built to prevent further escapes to freedom. Now, of course, the Soviets at this point in time claimed that the wall is really being built to prevent Westerners from coming into East Berlin or into East Germany, but in actuality it was really the opposite. East Germans were trying to escape to freedom in West Berlin, and so this concrete wall is built up. And early on there were numerous escapes made. Some people fled through buildings. Literally there were apartment complexes that were right on the border, and through some of those, while they built a brick wall right up to the apartments, you could climb out through the windows and actually end up into West Germany, or I should say West Berlin. So many people escaped to freedom that way. Eventually the Soviets came in and cleared out those buildings and then bricked up the walls entirely so that people couldn't escape that way. And we also had a very tense standoff at a place that becomes known as Checkpoint Charlie. Kennedy sent more troops, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson visited Berlin, and shortly after the erection of the Berlin Wall, this standoff occurs between U.S. and Soviet tanks on either side of Checkpoint Charlie. It began on October 22nd as a dispute over whether East German guards were authorized to examine the papers of a diplomat named Alan Leitner passing through East Berlin to see the opera. By October 27th, 10 Soviet and an equal number of American tanks stood on opposite sides of the checkpoint, and the standoff finally ended peacefully on October 28th. Kennedy said a wall is a lot better than a war. Over time, the wall was extended and fortified. Now, of course, eventually, Kennedy would travel to Berlin, where he would give his famous "I am a Berliner" speech, in which, speaking in German, he would say he was a Berliner. Now, we continued during the Kennedy administration to have tensions in Cuba. U.S. actions in the Bay of Pigs and the Berlin crisis encouraged hardliners in the Soviet Union. The Soviets were worried about another invasion of Cuba and U.S. nuclear missiles that were placed in Turkey. Kennedy was worried about accusations of being soft on communism. And then we have an incident where a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba detected Soviet surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, in Cuba. And the Soviets argued that the SAMs were defensive missiles and swore that they didn't have any offensive missiles in Cuba, but later U-2 flights proved that the Soviets had lied. This leads us to a great threat because the Soviets now could reach large portions of the eastern seaboard very easily. They could damage a lot of the United States with nuclear weapons based in Cuba. So this becomes known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy assembles a group of advisors that become known as XCOM, and to help him plan a response. XCOM military members favored an airstrike, perhaps followed by a land invasion of Cuba. Others argued for a naval blockade. Kennedy agreed with this plan. So they established what becomes known as a quarantine. Technically, a blockade is considered an act of war and is illegal. So rather than calling it a blockade, they call it a quarantine. And the world watched as Soviet ships that were carrying missile parts approached the naval blockade. Eventually, they turned back, and a crisis was averted. But there's still continuing tension. The whole thing really plays out over about 13 days. Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missiles if the United States pledged never to invade Cuba. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev took steps to ease tensions between their countries, and actually through kind of a secret backline channels communicated with each other, and they agreed to set up a hotline to allow direct communication between the two leaders. And part of a secret part of this agreement that ended the tensions was we promised we would remove our weapons from Cuba at a later date. The Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, ending atmospheric and underwater testing of nuclear weapons as well. And all of this comes about as the end, or as a part of the end of this Cuban Missile Crisis. But this is actually probably the point in the Cold War where we actually came the closest to all-out nuclear war with the Soviets. So now let's look at Kennedy's foreign policy. Kennedy believed in peace that did not have to be enforced with weapons of war. He believed in peace for Americans and for all men and women around the world. He created the Peace Corps, which trained and sent volunteers to Africa, Asia, and Latin America to serve for 2 years. Most of these volunteers were young college graduates, and this really increased goodwill towards the United States. He also was responsible for the Alliance for Progress, which offered billions of dollars in aid to Latin America to build schools, hospitals, roads, power plants, and low-cost housing. But now looking at his foreign policy related to the Cold War, Kennedy also followed the Cold War policies of his predecessors. He continued the nuclear arms buildup begun by Eisenhower. He continued to follow Truman's practice of containment. And he developed a strategy of what was known as flexible response, which meant strengthening conventional American forces so that the nation would have other options than nuclear weapons in times of crisis. And now in this section, we're going to be looking at Kennedy's 1,000 Days. And the main idea is that John F. Kennedy brought energy, initiative, and important new ideas to the presidency. Our learning objectives are to describe Kennedy's new frontier, to explain the ways that the Warren Court changed society in the early 1960s, and to describe the impact of Kennedy's assassination on the nation and the world. So first, looking at Kennedy's new frontier. Americans were struck by the youth and vitality of the Kennedy White House. Kennedy's public image was often different from reality. Kennedy's narrow victory in 1960 left him without the clear mandate that he needed to work well with Congress, and the new frontier came to be symbolized by the exploration of space. So, as far as image versus reality, images of Kennedy showed a young, vital president. But in reality, he suffered from Addison's disease and he had a bad back. Kennedy encouraged the press to photograph and write about his children while his wife Jacqueline Kennedy tried to protect their privacy. As far as dealing with Congress, most in the early 1960s were not reform-minded, which was reflected in Congress. Kennedy's narrow victory left him without a clear mandate to rule. Congress did approve many new frontier proposals, but sometimes Kennedy was able to bypass Congress and solve problems, but not always. As far as Kennedy's new frontier, a big part of that came to be symbolized, or his new frontier really came to be symbolized by the space program. Khrushchev claimed that the Soviet lead in space showed the superiority of communism, and of course this harkens back to what we looked at in the previous chapter with regards to the Soviets launching of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. So in May of 1961, Kennedy vowed that the United States would land a man on the moon. In fact, he said that we would do it by the end of the decade. And we did make it in July, on July 20th of 1969, we would successfully land a man on the moon. The space race became a part of the Cold War and a part that the United States would win. Now we're going to look at the Supreme Court in the early 1960s. During the Kennedy presidency, the Supreme Court made major changes in American society. Under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court rulings extended individual rights and freedoms. These included voting rights reform, the rights of the accused, and religious freedom. Many historians regard Earl Warren as one of the most important Chief Justices. Warren did not have a positive record on civil rights when President Eisenhower appointed him Chief Justice in 1953. He had called for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and he fought against the effort to make California's state assembly more representative of the people. However, as Chief Justice, Warren led the court to one of the most significant civil rights advances in U.S. history, that being the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. which banned racial segregation in the nation's schools. As far as voting rights reform, prior to legislation in the 1960s, states did not redraw boundaries of the legislative districts to reflect population changes. Then cases such as Baker versus Carr, 1962, Westbury versus Sanders, 1964, and Reynolds versus Sims, 1964, changed this practice to make each citizen's vote more equal. As far as the rights of the accused, one major Supreme Court case of the time period was Mapp versus Ohio. Another one was Gideon versus Wainwright. Mapp versus Ohio was from 1961. Gideon versus Wainwright was from 1963. Another one from the time period was Escobedo versus Illinois, 1964, and Miranda versus Arizona, 1966. And these cases extended the Bill of Rights to the actions of state governments. And in fact, it's where we now get our Miranda rights from, which of course is what people are read when they're arrested. They're informed of their Miranda rights, such as you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you. These rights are now required by law, and they're referred to as your Miranda rights because they date back to this Miranda versus Arizona case. As far as religious freedom, another major case from the period was Engel versus Vitale in 1962, and in other cases. The Warren Court defined the religious guarantees of the First Amendment. Now we're going to look at the Kennedy assassination. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Vice President Johnson was sworn in within hours, and Kennedy's death shocked the nation and the world. In fact, to this day, this is the last president that we have had that has died in office. And once again, Kennedy being one of our younger presidents, it was very shocking to Americans to have had him assassinated. Within hours, police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald. While being transferred to the county jail, Oswald was shot to death by Jack Ruby. And this leads us now to many conspiracies relating to the Kennedy assassination. There's great debate on whether or not this was a conspiracy. Some people believe that it was a conspiracy, that there were multiple shooters. Some people believe that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. Different government investigations have come to different conclusions. So there's a great deal of debate. It's one of those great enduring mysteries. And like I said, the fact that Jack Ruby shot and killed Oswald only added to the suspicions that maybe he was taking out the potential suspects of a conspiracy that I've heard flown around, or everyone from the mob, which is probably the most likely candidate, to the Soviet Union, or even to Vice President Johnson himself. So there's a great deal of debate on who actually was behind the killing, or whether it was simply Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. So this leads us now to the Warren Commission, which, what happens to the strange circumstances that surrounded Kennedy's death caused people to wonder whether Oswald had acted alone in killing the president. So President Johnson appointed the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination. They determined that there was no conspiracy and that Oswald and Ruby had each acted alone. Additional government investigations and many private ones never found credible evidence of a conspiracy, but yet there are still the fact that there have been some conflicting government reports and some things that don't seem to add up to certain people. And it's really hard for a lot of people to accept that a loser like Oswald could have taken out a man that many people consider to be as great as Kennedy. So now looking at Kennedy's legacy, as far as foreign relations, some felt the drama of the Kennedy presidency was more evident than its achievements. However, in foreign affairs, relations with the Soviet Union had improved. The Peace Corps produced goodwill towards the United States. As far as domestic achievements, Kennedy did not have much success with domestic issues. He acknowledged that the nation's social, economic, and environmental problems would take many years to solve.